Eleanor was 61 years old. Her husband Richard had been buried 3 weeks earlier, on the 18th of January, after a heart attack at the dining table on a Tuesday evening, halfway through a bowl of soup he had said was very good. On the 7th of February, on a cold grey Saturday afternoon, she had decided, because the children had said it would help her, and because she had begun to think they might be right, to begin the slow administrative work of going through Richard's things. She had started in the garage. On the high shelf above the workbench, behind a tin of paint that had not been opened in 12 years, she found a small metal Yale key, on a ring, attached to a green plastic tag. The tag bore, in Richard's careful engineering hand, 3 letters and 3 numbers.
Pa 417. I did not recognize it. Not the lettering, not the format. We did not have a storage unit. We had never, in 41 years of marriage, had a storage unit. I held the key in my hand for a long time, and I sat down on the small folding camp chair we kept in the garage, and I understood, before I understood anything else, that I was going to spend whatever was left of the next several months finding out what my husband had been keeping in PAS 417.
This is Eleanor. 61 years old. Recently retired from a career as a head of English at a sixth form college in North London. 3 adult children, Helen, 36, a barrister, Tom, 33, a music teacher, Caroline, 30, an architect, all of them out of the house, all of them with children of their own. A modest detached house in Mill Hill that she and Richard had bought in 1987. A husband who had been, by every available measure for 41 years, the kind of partner she had told her own daughters she hoped they would each, in the fullness of time, find for themselves. Richard had been 63. A retired civil engineer. The kind of man who had catalogued his tools alphabetically in the garage, who had kept every receipt for every appliance for the previous decade, who had, Eleanor had often joked at dinner parties, left his car at the door of every restaurant they had ever eaten in lined up perfectly between the white lines. On the 7th of February, in the garage, Eleanor had been sorting tools by category, woodwork, plumbing, electrical, and putting the ones the boys did not want into boxes for the British Heart Foundation shop on Mill Hill Broadway. At 3:47 p.m., she found the key. The key was attached to a ring she had never seen before. The ring was attached to a green plastic tag. The tag had 3 letters and 3 numbers, PAS for 17, written in Richard's particular engineering hand, in fine black Indian ink, in the way Richard had labelled everything he had ever owned. Eleanor sat in the garage for a long time. Then she went into the kitchen, made herself a cup of tea, and rang her oldest daughter Helen, who was at home in Hampstead.
I told Helen what I had found. Helen, who is 36 and a barrister and who is, as I have been telling people since she was 3 years old, the most factual person I have ever known, said, "Mum, before we do anything else, please do not open it without me."
Eleanor agreed. She did not open it without Helen. What she did not yet know was that her oldest daughter had been waiting to receive that phone call for 8 years. A 2024 study by the Department of Forensic Sociology at Queen Mary University of London, examining the discovery of concealed parallel lives following the death of one partner in a long marriage, identified what the authors named the posthumous threshold. The threshold is the moment at which a surviving spouse, in the course of ordinary administrative tidying, encounters an object, a key, a receipt, a phone, a letter, that does not fit into the marriage they thought they had been in. In the cases studied, 67% of these objects were discovered within the first 90 days following the death. The most common location was the garage. The second was the home study. The third was the deceased partner's car. The second finding is more uncomfortable. In 41% of cases, at least one adult child of the marriage had been aware of the parallel life, in some form, for some period before the parent's death. The reasons given for the silence, by adult children, most commonly fell into one of 3 categories. The first was protection of the surviving parent. The second was reluctance to disrupt the parent's final years. The third, given by 23% of adult children, and noted by the researchers as the most difficult to interrogate, was a calculation that the parallel life would, in some sense, end with the death of the parent who had been conducting it. that the surviving parent, by surviving, would receive an inheritance of grief that would be cleaner than the inheritance of disclosure. Helen, Eleanor's oldest daughter, had made the third calculation in 2017. On the 7th of February, when her mother rang her with the news of a key labelled PAS for 17, Helen understood, in the small private space of the half-second before she answered, that the calculation had been overtaken by events. Eleanor and Richard had met in 1981 at a teaching union conference in Brighton. Eleanor had been 20, in her second year of her undergraduate degree, attending as a junior trainee delegate. Richard had been 23, 4 years into his engineering career, attending as the union representative for his small firm. He had asked her, at the conference dinner, whether she had read Larkin. She had said, with what was, at 20, an entirely unironic enthusiasm, that she had. They had married in 1984. Helen had come in 1989. The marriage, in Eleanor's account, had been the central organizing fact of her adult life. Richard had been a steady, slightly formal man, given to careful explanations and structured weekends. He had read the children long Saturday night chapters of Conan Doyle. He had taken them on the same family holiday to a small cottage in the Lake District every August for 23 consecutive years. He had remembered, every July 14th, to bring Eleanor a small bunch of stocks from the corner of the garden that she had planted on the day they had moved in. He had not, in 41 years, given Eleanor any clear external sign that he was anything other than the partner he presented himself to be. In retrospect, and Eleanor would say this in the small private voice of a woman who had spent the previous several weeks revising 41 years backwards, the only thing she could think of was that, for the past decade, Richard had taken approximately 1 weekend a month to himself. He had called these weekends engineer time. He had told her, with the particular precision of a man for whom precision was the entire register of self-presentation, that he liked, every now and then, to drive somewhere alone, sit in a small Premier Inn, read engineering journals, and think. Eleanor had not begrudged him these weekends. They had given her time, in fact, to read the long novels she liked and that Richard found narratively undisciplined. Approximately 1 weekend a month, for 10 years, was when Eleanor sat down on the morning of the 8th of February with a notebook and her oldest daughter, 120 weekends. PAS for 17, when Helen and Eleanor located it on the morning of the 9th of February, turned out to be in the town of Pasley, Buckinghamshire, 68 miles from the house in Mill Hill, in a small storage facility behind a railway line, in a building of 150 units, of which Richard had rented number 417 for the previous 11 years. On the morning of the 9th of February, Eleanor and Helen drove together from Mill Hill to Pasley. The drive took 91 minutes. They did not, in the car, speak about what they expected to find. Helen had told her mother, in the kitchen the previous evening, that she had been aware for some time that something existed which Eleanor had not been told about. She had said she would explain on the way home, or in the unit, depending on what they found. Eleanor had said, in the small precise tones of a woman who had taught 516-year-olds how to read for inference, Helen. Tell me one thing. Was there a child? Helen, who had been driving, had not taken her eyes off the road. She had said, in the careful neutral voice of a barrister who had decided to give her client the truth in the form her client had asked for it.
No, Mum. There was not a child.
Eleanor had said, thank you, and they had not spoken further until Pasley. At the storage facility, the manager, a woman in her 50s called Margaret Pike, who had been managing the facility for 9 years, had received them at the front desk with the small precise efficiency of a woman who had been informed, the previous evening by telephone, that the family of the long-term renter of Unit 417 would be visiting this morning. Margaret had asked for identification. Helen had presented her practicing certificate as a barrister, the death certificate, and a copy of the will granting Eleanor probate. Margaret had taken these to a back office, photocopied them, returned them, and given Eleanor a clipboard with a single sheet of paper that recorded the access of the unit on the date of the visit. She had then walked Eleanor and Helen down a long concrete corridor, past identical orange roller shutter doors, to Unit 417. Eleanor had unlocked the unit with the key from the green plastic tag. The unit was 8 feet by 10 feet. It was clean. It was almost empty. It contained one large fireproof safe, 4 feet tall, located against the back wall. One wooden filing cabinet, for drawers, painted dark green of the kind a small civil engineering firm might have used in the 1970s. One cardboard box, sealed with parcel tape, the size of a large laptop carrying case. One folding wooden chair, of a kind Richard had owned since the early years of their marriage. And, on the back of the door of the unit, hanging from a single nail, a small framed black and white photograph of a young woman, in the dress style of approximately 1979, smiling at the camera with the unmistakable open joy of someone whose photograph was being taken by a person she loved. Eleanor recognized the woman. She had not seen her since 1980. The woman in the photograph was a person called Catherine Howell. Catherine had been Richard's fiancée before Eleanor. The engagement had ended in 1980, 6 months before Eleanor and Richard had met. Catherine had, at the time of the engagement ending, been 21 years old. She had been, by Richard's own account at the time, a bright, somewhat unstable young woman who had been admitted to a psychiatric hospital in May of 1980 with what was then called a depressive episode, and who had ended her own life, in the August of that same year, while still inside the hospital, 3 months before her 22nd birthday. Eleanor had known about Catherine. She had known the broad outline since approximately their 5th date. Richard had told her, with what had felt at the time like the particular candor of a man who wanted his future to be a continuation of his past rather than a flight from it, that Catherine had been a person he had loved, that her death had been the most difficult event of his life, and that he was telling Eleanor about her now because he did not want any future relationship between them to begin with a silence. Eleanor had been 21 when Richard had told her this. She had been moved by it. She had, in retrospect, and the retrospect had become continuous since the 7th of February, taken the disclosure as proof of Richard's emotional precision rather than as the announcement of a structure. In storage unit for 17, on the morning of the 9th of February, looking at a 45-year-old framed photograph of Catherine Howell that her dead husband had kept on a nail in a storage unit in Buckinghamshire for the previous 11 years, Eleanor sat down in the wooden folding chair and did not, immediately, weep. She said, after a long moment,
"Helen, what is in the safe?"
Helen produced, from her own handbag, a small envelope. The envelope contained a key. Helen explained, in 7 sentences, what the key was, where it had come from, when she had been given it, and why she had not, until that morning, given it to Eleanor. The key had been given to Helen, in 2017, by Richard. He had told Helen, then 28, recently called to the bar, that he was giving her this key as a contingency, that there were certain things in his life, dating from before he had met her mother, that he had kept in a private place, and that if he died before Eleanor, he wanted Helen to be the person who decided what to do with them. He had told Helen that he had not told Eleanor. He had told her that he had not told her brother or sister. He had told Helen that the contents of the safe were the kind of thing a man only tells one person, and I am telling you, because you are the calmest person I know. Helen had, in 2017, accepted the key. She had, in the 8 years since, considered, many times, telling her mother that she had it. She had concluded, each time, that the moment for telling had not arrived. On the 7th of February, when her mother had rung from the kitchen with the news of a small Yale key labelled PAS for 17, Helen had understood that the moment had now arrived. The safe was opened with the small key Helen had carried in her handbag for 8 years. Inside, in alphabetical and chronological order, because Richard, in life, had not believed in any other order, were 3 categories of object. The first category, occupying the top shelf, was a series of letters. There were 173 of them. They were addressed to Catherine Howell. They were written in Richard's hand. They were dated, the earliest from the 3rd of August 1980, 3 days before Catherine's death, and the latest from the 5th of January, for years before Eleanor was opening the safe. The letters had not been sent. They had been written, deposited in the safe, and never posted. Eleanor read 3 of them, in the storage unit, sitting on the folding chair, while Helen stood beside her in silence. The first letter, dated the 3rd of August 1980, was the letter Richard had been writing to his fiancée when he had been told, by the hospital, that she had taken her own life. The letter was incomplete. It ended mid-sentence, on the word tomorrow. The middle letter, dated November 2009, described a small holiday Richard and Eleanor had taken to the Yorkshire Dales. The letter said, in Richard's careful prose, "I think you would have liked the sheep." The final letter, dated for years before the opening of the safe, was a single paragraph. It said, "Kathy, I do not write to you as often anymore. The girls' children take up the time I used to give to writing to you. I am not less sorry. I am only less able. I love you. Richard." Eleanor read the final letter and did not, even then, weep. The second category, occupying the middle shelf, was a binder of documents. The binder contained copies of the original police statements Richard had made in August 1980 following Catherine's death, a series of letters to and from Catherine's parents in the 1980s and 1990s, copies of Richard's annual donations, £200 a year, for 43 years, to a small mental health charity in Manchester that had been founded in Catherine's name, and a series of photographs of Richard, every August, on the third Saturday of the month, standing at Catherine's grave in a small churchyard in the village outside Manchester where she had been buried. Eleanor counted the photographs. There were 43 of them. One per year. Richard had, for the entirety of her marriage, visited Catherine's grave on a single Saturday in August. Eleanor and Richard had spent the August of every year on the same family holiday in the Lake District for 23 consecutive years. The drive from the cottage in the Lake District to Catherine's grave was, Helen had calculated on her phone in the storage unit, 2 hours and 40 minutes. The third category, occupying the bottom shelf, was a single ring. The ring was a Victorian engagement ring, a small sapphire surrounded by a halo of seed pearls, in a green velvet ring box. Eleanor recognized the ring. Richard had given an identical ring, purchased 44 years earlier in 1981 from a small antiques dealer in Brighton, shortly after Eleanor's 21st birthday, to Eleanor as her own engagement ring. The ring on Eleanor's left hand at that moment, on the morning of the 9th of February, was the same design. The ring in the safe was the original ring. The one Richard had bought, in 1979, for Catherine. Eleanor's ring was a duplicate. Eleanor closed the safe. She did not, in the storage unit, cry. She did not, in the storage unit, speak. She thanked Helen, briefly, for being there. She walked back down the concrete corridor with Helen at her side. She handed Margaret Pike the key, signed the access record, and accepted from Margaret a small printed receipt confirming the date and time of the visit. On the drive home, somewhere on the M40 between High Wycombe and London, Eleanor said,
"Helen, I want you to tell me the version of this story that you have, in your own head, been carrying since 2017.
Helen, with both hands on the steering wheel, gave it to her mother in 8 minutes.
Dad told me, in 2017, in his study at home, with the door closed, that he had loved a woman before you, that she had died, that he had handled her death the way an engineer handles a structural failure, by writing detailed reports of it for 43 years that no one else would ever read, and that he was, by his own admission, a man who had built his second life on top of his first life rather than instead of it. He told me he had not ever, in any way, been physically unfaithful to you. He told me he had not ever, in any way, neglected the family he had built with you. He told me that he had decided, at some point in the late 1980s, that his interior life was not yours, and was, in his phrasing, a private burden it would be cruel to ask anyone else to carry. He told me he understood that his decision was a kind of betrayal, not of you, but of the terms on which you had married him. He told me he had not been able, in any of the previous several decades, to identify the right moment to disclose what he had done. He asked me to keep the safe, after he died, until I judged the right moment had arrived. He apologized. He said he was sorry. He cried for approximately 14 minutes in his study chair. I was 28. I made him a cup of tea. I took the key. I have not spoken about it again, until today, with anyone.
Eleanor listened. When Helen had finished, Eleanor said one thing.
Helen, I do not blame you for not telling me.
Helen took her right hand off the steering wheel. She put it on her mother's hand. They drove the rest of the way to Mill Hill in silence. Eleanor spent the following 10 days alone in the Mill Hill house. She did not tell Tom. She did not tell Caroline. She did not tell her own sister. She did, on the third evening, tell the parish priest who had buried Richard, a man named Father Gerard, with whom Eleanor had been acquainted, in a polite, undemanding way, for 31 years. Father Gerard listened to the entire account in his small study off the church vestry. He did not, when Eleanor finished, offer any of the responses she had been quietly afraid he might offer. He did not say Richard was a good man, though Eleanor would have, 6 weeks earlier, agreed. He did not say we cannot judge the dead, though Eleanor was not, by that point in her life, looking to. What Father Gerard said, after a long pause, was, Eleanor, there are 2 questions in front of you. The first is about Richard, and that question I am not the right person to help you with. The second is about you. The second question is, what kind of widow do you want to be? Eleanor thought about this for 9 days. On the 11th day, she drove back to Pasley alone. She did not take Helen. She did not call Margaret Pike beforehand. She arrived at the storage facility at 20 minutes past 10 in the morning, signed in, walked down the concrete corridor, unlocked Unit 417, and stood inside it for a long time. What she did, that morning, and this is the part of the story that surprised even Helen, was the following. She took the framed photograph off the nail. She took the binder of charity donation records. She took the safe of 173 letters. She took the Victorian sapphire engagement ring, in its green velvet box. She loaded all of it carefully into her car. She drove the 4 hours to the small village outside Manchester. At Catherine Howell's grave, in the small churchyard Eleanor had never been to, Eleanor sat on a stone bench for a long time. She did not bury anything. She did not burn anything. She placed the photograph on the grave. She placed the green velvet ring box, opened, beside it, with the original sapphire ring inside. She placed, on top of the ring box, a single sheet of paper on which she had written, in her own steady teacher's hand, 6 lines.
Catherine, my husband Richard, who you knew, died on the 14th of January. He spent 43 years writing to you, in private. The letters are with me now. I have read them. I will keep them safe, for the rest of my life, in his memory and in yours. He was, by every measure I had access to, a kind man. Whatever else he was also that. Eleanor.
She left the photograph and the ring on the grave. She drove home. On the M6, somewhere outside Stoke-on-Trent, Eleanor stopped at a service station and, for the first time since the 7th of February, wept for 43 minutes, while a small child in the next car, eating chips, watched her with the unembarrassed curiosity of a 4-year-old. Eleanor told Tom and Caroline for months later, at a long Sunday lunch in Mill Hill in May. She did not give them the full account she had given Father Gerard. She told them the version that mattered. That their father had loved a woman who had died very young, before they had been born, that he had carried that love quietly, throughout his life, that he had not been physically unfaithful, but that he had, by his own admission to Helen, built his life with their mother on top of a private grief he had decided not to share, and that their mother had, in the months since the discovery, decided what she felt about it. Tom asked one question. He asked whether his father had loved his mother. Eleanor said, after a long moment,
Yes. He loved me, in his way, for 41 years. The fact that part of him also loved someone else does not, I have decided, cancel that. It complicates it. It does not cancel it.
Caroline asked whether Eleanor had wanted, at any point, to throw the letters away. Eleanor said, no. I have read them. They are honest. They are not unkind to me. They are, in some places, almost unbearably kind to me. I will keep them. When I die, you and your sister and your brother will decide what to do with them. That is your inheritance. I am giving it to you knowing that it is, at minimum, a complicated inheritance. I am sorry. I am also, on balance, not sorry. Tom said, after a long pause, "I think Dad loved you, Mum. I think it is possible to love someone the way Dad loved you and also to keep something separate. I do not know if I would forgive it. But I think, for 41 years, I had a father, and you had a husband. I am not going to revise that backwards, because it was true." Eleanor wept. Caroline made tea. Helen, who had been sitting at the end of the table and had not spoken for the entire conversation, took the storage unit key out of her own handbag, placed it on the table in front of her mother, and slid it across to her. Eleanor picked it up. She has, since the May Sunday lunch, kept the storage unit at Pasley. She drives to it once a year, on the third Saturday of August, the same day Richard had been visiting Catherine's grave, and she sits in unit for 17, on the wooden folding chair, and reads 3 of the letters at random. The framed photograph and the original engagement ring are still on Catherine's grave, in a small ceramic box that the parish gardener, a kind man called Geoffrey, who has known the grave for 15 years, has built into the stone. They are weatherproof. They are not advertised. They are looked after. On the third Saturday of August, 3 years after Richard's death, Eleanor drove from Pasley to Manchester. She has, since then, made the same drive each year. At Catherine's grave, she does not say anything aloud. She does not, any more, bring anything. She sits on the stone bench. She looks at the photograph and the ring box, which are still there, weatherproofed, in their small ceramic recess. She thinks, every year, about what kind of widow she has decided to be. She is not, by her own assessment, certain that she has chosen the right kind. She is, by her own assessment, certain only that she has chosen. If you are listening to this story, and you are someone who has, in the recent or distant past, lost a long-term partner, and have begun the slow administrative work of going through their things, this is what Eleanor would say to you. She would say that the things you find may not be what you expected. She would